Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Two stories dominate the news, ISIS and Greece. And we're going to talk about both. On the eve of tomorrow's referendum in Greece, and apparently on the eve of an imminent decision by the British Parliament to begin bombing yet another Arab Muslim country. Hey, what could go wrong?
ISIS control half of Syria and much of Iraq. Their fighters are murdering sunbathers on the Mediterranean beaches, worshippers in Kuwaiti mosques, and who knows who, what, and where next.
If anyone on this planet does know, it's Britain's foreign correspondent of the year. And any year, if you ask me, the independent newspaper's Patrick Cockburn. Patrick, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. We showcased your book, the best by far, on the ISIS phenomenon, the rise of Islamic State, the last time you were here. The problem is it's continued to rise and rise. How do you summarize now, in what, a few months since you were last here, what's the current state of play with ISIS?
Well, it's pretty bad in the sense for humanity because ISIS is still expanding. I mean, it's a year since they declared their caliphate on the 29th of June last year. Since then, there have been lots of stories about how it's suffering heavy casualties from bombing, how it's on the retreat, how it's imploding, or there's a stalemate. But in May, we saw that's not true. They defeated the Iraqi army at Ramadi, and they defeated the Syrian army at Palmyra. So it's still expanding.
Still expanding even in the Levant, but of course expanding now across the world, and we'll come to that. But you made the point in The Independent that talk of the liberation of Mosul, for example, the Arab Iraq's second city, was fanciful. That far from retaking Mosul, the likelihood was that ISIS would retake areas and cities like Ramadi that had been so-called liberated. Isn't the problem that the people in these areas don't much feel that it is a liberation for the government in Baghdad to kick out the ISIS? Perhaps they think each is as bad as the other.
Or worse. I mean, I know people in Mosul, talk to people from Ramadi, and people will say how bad the Islamic State is, how terrified they are of them. And then at a certain point, the conversation will switch. And they'll start saying, well, what would happen if the Iraqi army comes in or the Shia militia comes in? It'll be even worse. It'll be worse because they're frightened of being murdered. They know if you're a Sunni there that you'll be suspected of being an ISIS supporter, whatever your views. And they also know that ISIS is more efficient than the Iraqi government. In Ramadi, since they took over, I was in touch with somebody there who doesn't much like them, but said the local hospital has reopened because they brought in doctors from Syria. There's more electricity, but they brought in big generators from Raqqa, their Syrian capital, and from Fallujah. So these guys, I mean, monsters though they are also pretty efficient.
They know how to make the trains run on time. There are natural barriers, in a way, to any further advance by ISIS in Iraq. At least I hope so. The Kurdish area would appear more or less impregnable to them. And the Shia Muslim mass in Baghdad and Basra and areas of the south of Iraq, ditto. But in Syria, that's not true. My belief is, and again, of course, it's the opposite of what I wish to happen, that it is possible that ISIS and other gangs could be in control of Damascus and thus of a country with a Mediterranean shoreline? What could go wrong, as I joked earlier? Is it your belief that the Syrian state is on the back foot and may, in the end, capitulate?
I think we're not quite there yet. It still has support. It also has a lot of people, just like we were saying, there are a lot of Sunni in Iraq who don't much like ISIS, but are terrified of the alternative, which is the Iraqi government. There are quite a lot of people in Damascus who don't particularly like the Assad government, but they're truly terrified of the alternative in Islamic State because they think they'll have their heads cut off. They think that they might be imprisoned, or they'll certainly lose their job. So there are a lot of people who are squeezed into the same corner as the government who don't necessarily support it. But that's quite a chunk of the Syrian population, so I don't think it'll go down just like that. You have a sort of very violent stalemate with neither side capable of overcoming the other. And there's not much reason that this should change. I suppose there could be a sudden collapse on the government side, or they might lose a city, a big city or something like that. But I think that it's sort of unlikely that there'll be a dramatic change in the military situation.
Is it possible that a de facto state has already been created in the west of Iraq and in the north and east of Syria, and that we have to come to terms with that, perhaps even recognize it?
Well, I'd like to divide it into two. I mean, there's no doubt a state has been established there. It has a state with an army which is more powerful than most members of the UN. If you talk to, I've been talking to people who've come from within the self-declared caliphate, and they collect taxes there rather efficiently. They conscript soldiers. They decide the school, what should be taught at schools. They can defend the, so to speak, the frontiers of the caliphate. So, you know, if this isn't a state, what is? Now, should we recognize it or anything like that? Well, these guys aren't in the business of recognizing anybody else because they want to spread the caliphate to all the Muslim world and then all the world. So that is not on their agenda. And also, I think it's a mistake about the nature of this movement. You know, it's like an Islamic Khmer Rouge. It's a cult, and it also has a combination, a very dangerous combination of fanaticism, religious fanaticism in this case, and military expertise drawn on years of fighting the Americans and the Iraqi army.
But the spreading of the caliphate's already happening, isn't it? The Boko Haram in Nigeria have declared Borno to be a part of it. ISIS affiliates in Libya, including in Sirte, the former home of Gaddafi, have declared themselves to be a part of it. And in Tunisia, ISIS claims that the mass murder of tourists on the beaches was carried out by one of their men.
Yes, I mean, the Islamic State is a sort of magnet for groups. Some of them, you know, are probably in contact with Islamic State. Others are simply imitating their tactics. They have a very lethal cocktail of tactics, of atrocities committed in very public places to have maximum impact. And this is pretty effective. So, you know, if we go from the Pakistan border over to northeast Nigeria, there are 7 wars going on now in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, northeast Nigeria. And to my mind, ISIS it's the child of war, and it benefits from war because this is what it's good at. And so long as we have these wars going on, the people who benefit will be those who are the most extreme, like Islamic State, and it will continue to grow.
We discuss ISIS, the phenomenon of ISIS, quite regularly on the show, but we rarely get someone from the field, like yourself. You've just come from Iraq, and you've been in Syria as well during the rise of Islamic State. How is it like for people living there, including yourself, reporting from there. What's the impact on the daily lives of the women, the children? Do they go to school, to the markets as usual? Do they stay indoors?
Well, yeah, ISIS likes to monopolize power politically, but also over the lives of everybody living under its rule. So quite early on, it was determining what the curriculum would be in schools. So art and history were out. Geography could be taught, but not national boundaries, only regional geography. Pagan poetry. Poetry was allowed, but not pagan poetry, which probably means most poetry. Anyway, this is one example. Every aspect of life is controlled by them. If a woman goes out unaccompanied by a male relative, then ISIS fighters or officials will take her back to the house, ask for the husband to come out, and will give him 80 lashes. Barbers. When they took Fallujah early last year, they closed down most of the barber shops. My newspaper was talking to one barber from there who he gave his cousin, on his cousin's wedding day, a rather Western haircut, in return for which somebody informed on him they gave him 80 lashes. He fainted after 50 lashes and had to be taken to hospital, and they closed his barber shop. So every aspect of life is controlled by them. People don't like it, but there's not much they can do about it.
Well, they'll end up crucified or beheaded or all these hideous ways that they have reinvented, I should say, to murder people. Patrick Cockburn, I wish we could talk all day. Thanks very much for joining us on the Sputnik. Read his book, if you haven't already, The Rise of Islamic State.
Coming up after this break, who knew that Greece could be the Achilles heel of the entire European project? Well, most people actually, and we'll be discussing why next.
Welcome back to what is rapidly becoming a classic edition of Sputnik. Barely 3 years after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the European Union appears to be at war again, this time in full-blown economic conflict with one of its own founding members, Greece, which presently endures, in effect, an economic embargo, preventing its banks from opening.
The origins of the conflict partly rest with the euro currency itself.
The euro, or more particularly the practical compulsion on most member states to join it, was fatally flawed as a project, subsuming widely disparate economies and accounting standards into a single currency with a single central bank and a single set of neoliberal free market dogmas.
Greece, with the help of Goldman Sachs, falsified its financial position in order to gain entry to the European Monetary Union, and the rest is history.
As might be the European Union at this rate. To discuss the Grexit or not, Alex Andreou, actor and Guardian writer, joins us now. Alex, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. Tomorrow is the big day, the referendum. First of all, what's your take on how that referendum is going to go, and, if you like, your opinion on how it should go?
It's extremely unpredictable. There seems to be quite a high percentage where the no is leading, which is basically saying no to the agreement that was offered. But you have to understand that with every passing day, capital controls, people queuing up to get 60 euros out, the country is paralyzed more and more, and that terror, that fear will play a part in the yes and no's, as well as the fact that the private media in Greece is incredibly biased against the government because they're owned by very rich people who actually owe money in license fees and taxation, and this government is going after them. So they have a very clear agenda against Syria. And so there is relentless propaganda and an economic asphyxiation going on. So my very, very tentative prediction is that we will end up with a very narrow victory. I don't know for which side, but I think it will narrow down, which is a disaster for either side, actually. What you want is a decisive a vote for either yes or no. What you don't want is a close result, because that simply divides the country in two.
Relentless propaganda internally, no doubt, from the private sector media, and quite a bit of it from outside.
Yeah.
I must say, though some may find this a controversial point to make, given the modern history of Germany and Greece, I find the sight of a German chancellor issuing diktat to the Greek people to be profoundly offensive. And I'm surprised that, given that history, that the Germans have not taken a self-denying ordinance, at least in public pronouncements on this. How do Greek people feel about being threatened and warned like this?
Can I just add before that question? Because early this morning we saw a picture from 1953 where the Greek PM was signed off 50% debt to
the haircut for Germany. That's been going... personally, I don't think that is a helpful avenue, simply because we want to get away from blaming a country as a totality for the sins of its leaders, especially for the sins of its leaders in the distant past, because that is an attitude that feeds very negatively into the Greek situation. One of the obstacles with resolving the Greek situation is that people say, but Greece falsified its accounts to get into the euro, but Greece borrowed irresponsibly, but Greece spent the money. And I think what's useful to do is to separate actually who did those things. Yeah. It wasn't Greece as a total, you know, it wasn't the cleaners and the teachers that took the money and you know, lived a high life. It was actually a mendacious and corrupt government of many years ago. Now, if you accept that, then you still have to take responsibility as a country, I think, because you elected those people. But what people must understand is that the corruption and the overspending that went on in the past 4 decades is the reason why Greece was a ripe victim for financial markets to speculate on. But it's not what caused the crisis. You know, Greek train drivers retiring early did not cause Lehman Brothers to collapse. Having too many nurses did not cause currency speculators, as Angela Merkel herself identified in 2011. She made a speech in February 2011 in Hamburg, where she said, the very institutions that we went into debt to bail out are now using that money to speculate against the currency. And that's a very difficult thing to explain to democratic people who should trust us. Those were her words precisely. Now, that narrative seems to have disappeared, because it is inconvenient and it is difficult to explain. And it's been replaced instead by this idea that, you know, people going for a siesta in the afternoon when it's too hot, that's responsible for the trouble Europe is in. But it isn't. It isn't. And to fall for that, I think, is very dangerous, because there's a systemic flaw inside the euro. You know, you have countries that do not have their hands on the monetary levers that mean they can deflate their currency if their economy is suffering. And once Greece is dealt with, whatever way that is, either it is punished and put in a corner, or it's thrown out of the euro, or it accepts every measure under the sun and is forgotten about, they will move on to the next weakest link. They will move on to Portugal. They will move on to Ireland.
Well, the IMF themselves, in their own leaked documents, acknowledged that it would be 2030 before Greece would be out of the woods if it accepts this proscription. And secondly, the point, as you rightly imply, that has been entirely missed, is that the Greek people were not given any of this money.
I think about 10% actually is the figure. 10% of the total bailout funds has not gone to private, to bail out private French and German banks.
Yes. So in fact, the EU is giving money to Greece.
Money
but in fact, it's not to Greece.
Absolutely.
It's to their own banks.
Absolutely. It is the continuation of the bailout that started in 2008.
It's just
madness. Because people were rioting in the streets. A mechanism has been found to sort of do it via a country and conveniently also asset strip that country while it's all going on. You know, our telephone company was the first to be sold, highly profitable, went to a German conglomerate on a price that many consider to be very, very undervalued. Now, when people see that, they become angry. People passionately believe in the European project. I passionately believe in the European project, but not what it has become. And so, in that situation, you have the Troika sort of coming into the country and saying, as a sort of benevolent force, listen, things are really bad, but if you follow these steps, you'll come out of this difficulty. And 5 years on, the debt, instead of 120% of GDP, is now 180% of GDP. The economy has contracted by a quarter. I mean, I don't know if...
And a quarter of the people are unemployed.
A quarter of the people, 54% of people under 24. We're talking about an entire generation of people which is lost now. You know, you go to Athens, people are looking in rubbish bins for food. It's not... That's
the reality, yeah?
That's the reality. And so when people then are told by the very same institutions, no, okay, we were wrong then, but no, this time definitely you should follow what we say, there is a lack of trust. There isn't just, there's this idea that there's a lack of trust that flows only from the institution towards Greece because it's seen as a sort of naughty socialist child. You know, there is a huge lack of trust flowing from Greece towards the institution.
Yeah. Now, if Syriza loses tomorrow, it'll not be long before they're out of power.
I think so, yeah.
But as you say, if the vote is narrow, the polarization inside Greece is going to be extreme.
Yeah.
And even if Syriza falls from power, they're not going to go away, and the arguments they've been mounting are not going to be going away. Are you anxious about that?
I'm anxious because we have a history of civil conflict, you know, and I think everyone is anxious about that. I hope that we've moved on from that. I hope that we can, you know, tear strips out of each other and have our arguments with words, and it stops there. But even to look at, you know, the people from the various opposition parties lining up on TV and making these emotional speeches that we must vote yes to Europe, you know, for our children's sake. And these are the same people that, you know, pillaged this country for 4 decades like a plague of locusts. These corrupt governments absolutely destroyed the country, and the EU now, accepting that corruption is the biggest thing that needs to be tackled in Greece, should be cheering for Syriza, for a party which, although it doesn't agree with its ideology, it's at least clean. You know, it's an honest party. It doesn't have its fingers in all sorts of pies. And instead, it's helping reinstall the same people who caused all of these problems. And that, to me, sends a very clear message that they would rather have someone obedient but corrupt in power rather than someone honest but actually free-thinking.
Well, I couldn't put that better myself, and there's no time for me to try. Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the best of luck to Greece. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
About ISIS, Leo O'Hagan says, 1, end religion, problem solved. 2, regarding the Greek problem, a Greek friend once told me that fakes contain virtually all you need to survive. Throw in olives and feta cheese, problem solved. And that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.